I didn't leave when things broke. I left when nothing hurt anymore. That's the part people don't understand. They think you run when the pain is unbearable, when the fights become loud, when doors slam and voices crack. But that's not when you go. You go when silence becomes permanent. When even disappointment feels familiar. When you wake up one morning and realize you're not waiting for anything anymore. For a long time, I told myself I was being patient, mature, loyal. I believed that staying was a virtue, that endurance meant depth, that sacrificing parts of myself was the price of stability. I wore that belief like armor. It made me feel noble. It made me feel necessary. But what it really did was teach me how to disappear slowly. There was a version of me that used to want things. I remember him faintly, like a face seen through fog. He had opinions that weren't softened to avoid conflict. He laughed without checking the room first. He believed his time mattered. That version didn't die in a single moment. He faded through thousands of small concessions. I stopped correcting people when they misunderstood me. I stopped asking questions that made others uncomfortable. I stopped saying no when yes felt easier. None of it felt dramatic at the time. It felt reasonable. Practical. Adult. That's how it happens. The days became predictable. Wake up. Perform competence. Be agreeable. Return home. Sit in the same chair. Scroll without absorbing anything. Sleep without rest. Repeat. From the outside, my life looked calm. Stable. Functional. That word was used often, functional, as if it were the highest form of praise. Inside, something was hollowing out. I remember the exact moment I realized how far gone I was. It wasn't during an argument. It wasn't during a breakdown. It was during a conversation that should have mattered. Someone asked me what I wanted next. Not in life, just next. A plan. A direction. A preference. And my mind went completely blank. Not because I didn't want anything. But because I no longer knew how to listen to that part of myself. I had trained it to stay quiet for so long that it no longer responded. That scared me more than pain ever could. I began noticing how often I used the word fine. How quickly I adapted to inconvenience. How little resistance I offered when things were taken from me: time, energy, attention, dignity, as long as it happened politely. I was proud of being easy to live with. I see now how dangerous that pride was. There were signs. There are always signs. The way I avoided mirrors. The way I filled every silence with background noise. The way I stayed busy to avoid thinking. I told myself I was tired. Overworked. Burned out. Temporary states, I said. This will pass. But deep down, I knew the truth I refused to name. I wasn't tired. I was absent. People still spoke to me. I answered. People still touched my arm. I felt it, technically, but emotionally, I was somewhere else, watching myself from a distance, narrating my own life as if it belonged to someone I used to know. I stayed because leaving would have required honesty. And honesty would have forced me to admit how much of myself I had already given away without asking for anything in return. Staying felt safer than facing that loss. I told myself I was needed. That my absence would hurt others. That my sacrifice had meaning. But when I imagined disappearing completely, not dramatically, not violently, just quietly, the relief I felt was undeniable. That terrified me. Not because I wanted to die. But because I didn't feel particularly alive. At night, I would lie awake and imagine alternate versions of my life. Not fantasies of success or revenge or romance. Just small variations. Me in a different city. Me waking up alone but unafraid. Me making choices without rehearsing how they would be received. Those imagined lives felt more real than the one I was living. I began packing mentally long before I packed physically. Detaching from routines. Letting go of emotional investments. Observing instead of participating. When you plan to leave quietly, you start erasing yourself in advance. The final months passed without conflict. That's what makes them hardest to explain. Nothing was wrong enough to justify leaving. There was no villain. No single betrayal. Just a long accumulation of silence where a voice should have been. I remember standing in the doorway one evening, keys in my hand, and realizing I felt nothing about returning inside. No anticipation. No dread. Just neutrality. That was the moment I knew I had stayed too long. Not long after, I started preparing for a different kind of disappearance. Not an escape fueled by anger or pain, but a measured withdrawal. A controlled vanishing. The kind that leaves no scene behind. I didn't want closure. I wanted distance. I wanted to hear my own thoughts again without translating them for someone else. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider a dangerous question. What if staying had been the mistake all along? Once the idea of leaving settled inside me, everything changed. Not outwardly. Outwardly, my life remained almost offensively normal. I showed up. I answered messages. I smiled when it was expected. But internally, something had shifted its weight. Like a suitcase finally placed by the door, not moved yet, but no longer imaginary. What surprised me most was not the fear, but the guilt. Not loud guilt. Not dramatic self-reproach. A quieter kind. The kind that asks questions without accusing. The kind that sits beside you in silence and waits. Guilt for considering myself. Guilt for imagining a future that didn't include everyone who had grown accustomed to my presence. Guilt for wanting something undefined, something selfish, something that couldn't be easily justified. I had spent years being reliable. Predictable. Available. I had built an identity around not causing disruption. Around absorbing inconvenience so others wouldn't have to. When you live like that long enough, people stop seeing your effort. It becomes the baseline. And the moment you step away from it, you feel like you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. That's what made leaving feel like theft. I tried to negotiate with myself. I always do. I told myself I didn't need to disappear completely. That I could adjust instead of escape. Change the pace. Take a break. Ask for space. Reasonable solutions. Adult solutions. The kind that look good when explained out loud. But every version of staying, but differently, required one thing I no longer trusted myself to do. Speak honestly. I didn't know how to express my needs without immediately minimizing them. Without apologizing. Without framing them as inconveniences. I had trained myself too well. Even alone, my thoughts came with disclaimers. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this isn't that bad. Maybe this is just how life is. Those maybes had cost me years. The nights became heavier. I slept, but never deeply. I dreamed of unfinished conversations. Of rooms without doors. Of people talking to me while I tried to answer and couldn't produce sound. I would wake up with my jaw clenched, my chest tight, my body exhausted from holding in words that never left my mouth. During the day, I noticed how often I disappeared mid-conversation. How people would finish speaking and wait for a response that came a second too late. How often I nodded instead of engaging. I was present in shape only. A placeholder where a person used to be. And yet, when someone asked me if I was okay, I said yes automatically. The word came out so easily it scared me. Yes had become a reflex. A shield. A lie polished smooth by repetition. The truth was more complicated than not okay. I wasn't in crisis. I wasn't falling apart in visible ways. I was functioning. That's what made it dangerous. Because functional misery is rarely taken seriously, especially by the person living inside it. I told myself I didn't deserve to leave because nothing bad enough had happened. I compared my life to worse ones. Louder ones. More tragic ones. I used other people's pain as evidence against my own right to change. But comparison doesn't heal you. It just delays the reckoning. One evening, I tried to picture myself 5 years in the future if nothing changed. Same routines. Same compromises. Same quiet erasure. The image was unbearable not because it was horrific, but because it was so plausible. So easy. So likely. That future version of me wasn't angry. He wasn't broken. He was resigned. Polite. Smaller. And I realized something that made my hands shake. If I stayed, I would survive. But I would not recover. That thought stripped away the last of my denial. The next phase wasn't action. It was mourning. I mourned the version of myself who believed patience would be rewarded, who thought loyalty guaranteed reciprocity, who mistook endurance for love. I mourned the time I couldn't get back. The opportunities one declined because they felt inconvenient to others. The words I swallowed because they might have changed the temperature in the room. I mourned silently. No one noticed. That's the thing about internal endings, they rarely come with witnesses. The guilt didn't disappear. It sharpened. Every plan I made felt like a betrayal rehearsed in secret. I hated how calm I became about it. How methodical. How quietly resolved. I wondered what kind of person plans an exit without warning. Without confrontation. Without explanation. The answer scared me. Someone who no longer believes they will be heard. I wasn't running towards something specific. I wasn't chasing happiness. I was running away from becoming invisible permanently. From waking up one day and realizing even my own thoughts had stopped addressing me directly. The moment that broke me came unexpectedly. A small moment. A harmless one. Someone thanked me for always being understanding. I smiled. I said it was nothing. But inside, something collapsed. Because being understanding had cost me everything I didn't know how to name anymore. My anger. My boundaries. My voice. My urgency. My sense of self as someone who could take up space without apology. That night, I sat alone in the dark and admitted something out loud for the first time. I don't know who I am anymore. The words didn't echo. They didn't feel dramatic. They felt factual. Like a diagnosis delivered calmly after years of ignored symptoms. That was when the decision stopped being hypothetical. Leaving was no longer an option. It was the only remaining form of honesty. I didn't know yet how I would do it. Or when. Or what I would say, if anything at all. But I knew this much with terrifying clarity: if I stayed, I would disappear completely and no one would even notice it had happened. So I chose a different kind of disappearance. One where I left behind the version of me that had learned to survive by becoming smaller. I didn't announce my leaving. There was no speech. No dramatic pause. No final argument that clarified everything in a single moment. Real life doesn't offer that kind of symmetry. It just keeps moving, and at some point, you step out of its path quietly. I chose a morning that looked exactly like all the others. The sky was pale. The air was still. Nothing felt symbolic enough to mark the end of something so heavy. And maybe that was fitting. My life hadn't unraveled in flames. It had thinned. Slowly. Politely. Until it was barely there. I packed light. Not because I was disciplined, but because I had already let go of most things long before that day. When you detach emotionally, physical objects lose their weight. They stop anchoring you. They become optional. There was a moment, standing in the doorway, when I waited for something to stop me. A surge of doubt, A voice saying this was a mistake. A memory strong enough to pull me back inside. Nothing came. Only a strange calm, not relief, not joy, just quiet. That scared me more than fear ever could. Leaving didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like walking into a room where the echo hasn't caught up yet. Every step sounded wrong. Too loud. Too final. I kept expecting regret to hit me from behind, to grab my shoulder and demand an explanation. Instead, there was space. Uncomfortable space. Empty space. The kind you don't know how to furnish because you've spent so long adapting to other people's structures. The first days were the hardest. Not because I missed anyone specifically, but because I missed the role I used to play. When you build your identity around being needed, absence feels like erasure. I woke up unsure of who I was allowed to be when no one expected anything from me. There was no immediate rebirth. No montage of self-discovery. Just silence and uncertainty. I noticed how often I reached for my phone out of habit, not to connect, but to confirm I still existed in someone else's awareness. When no messages came, I had to face a terrifying thought. If no one is watching, who am I? I sat with that question longer than I wanted to. Longer than was comfortable. I didn't rush to answer it. For once, I didn't rush at all. Slowly, something unfamiliar happened. My thoughts began to sound like mine again. Not polished. Not filtered. Not pre-approved. Just raw, sometimes selfish, sometimes contradictory, sometimes unkind but honest. I caught myself forming opinions without immediately dismantling them. Feeling anger without apologizing for it internally. Wanting things without drafting an explanation for why I deserved them. That scared me too. Because honesty comes with responsibility. You can't hide behind endurance when you admit what you want. You can't call it patience when it's actually fear. You can't blame circumstances when you finally acknowledge your choices. I grieved again, but differently this time. I grieved the years I would never reclaim. The conversations I avoided. The boundaries I failed to draw. The moments when I taught people how little space I required, and then felt surprised when they treated me accordingly. That grief was sharp, but it was clean. It didn't rot inside me. It passed through. There were days I questioned everything. Days when I wondered if I had exaggerated my emptiness. If staying would have been easier. Kinder. More respectable. There is comfort in familiar suffering. At least you know its shape. But every time I imagined returning, I felt myself shrink again. And I understood something crucial. Leaving didn't fix me. It just stopped the damage. The rest was my responsibility. I had to learn how to take up space without asking permission. How to disappoint people without seeing it as a moral failure. How to let silence exist without rushing to fill it with usefulness. I had to learn how to be alone without feeling like I was being punished. That took time. There are still moments when guilt resurfaces. When I think about the people who never got an explanation. The versions of events they had to invent to make sense of my absence. I used to feel obligated to correct those stories. Now I let them exist. Because I finally understand this, not everyone who leaves owes a narrative. Sometimes survival requires privacy. Sometimes healing needs distance more than understanding. I didn't leave to be found. I left to hear myself again. And I did. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But enough to recognize the voice when it speaks. If there's one truth I carry now, it's this: staying too long doesn't make you loyal. It makes you invisible. And disappearing quietly isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's the first honest decision you've made in years. I don't know exactly where I'm going. I don't have a finished version of myself to present. I am still rebuilding, slower than I'd like, messy than I imagined. But this time, I am present for it. And that, finally, feels like a beginning.